welcome to the 6th Annual Intermountain Sustainability Summit. My name is Emily Malik, and I'm the president of Utah Recycling Alliance. We are so excited to be in the 6th year with this conference and have watched it, evolve over time. I can tell you from experience that countless hours go into planning this conference each year. We look forward to today's events and getting the opportunity to learn from each other as we interact today. And our hope is that some of you will form relationships that will last long past today's summit. For those of you who aren't familiar, Utah Recycling Alliance is a nonprofit organization that is committed to developing and promoting relationships, resources, and recycling programs throughout the state of Utah. We hope to empower the public to become more involved in waste management and resource conservation and to create networking opportunities for those who are already involved in the waste industry. We partner with Weber State University to bring you the Intermountain Sustainability Summit to help fulfill our organization's mission. And if you would like to learn a little bit more about Utah Recycling Alliance, take a moment to visit with us at our table today. It's just outside the doors here next to the registration table. Before we begin with our keynote speakers today, I would like to offer a special thanks to all of our sponsors, including our platinum sponsors, iUtah, an NSF-funded EPSCoR project, Weber State University Goddard School of Business, our gold sponsors, Wattstopper and Catalyst, our silver sponsors, AMD Architecture, Architectural Nexus, Codell Electric Supply, Pathos Sands, UAMPS, Utah Department of Environmental Quality, Utah Office of Energy Development, Weber Morgan Health Department, our poster competition sponsor, VCBO Architecture, Utah Transit Authority for donating several UTA passes for people to get here today from the Salt Lake Valley, Sodexo for donating the China service for today's meals so that we could reduce our waste, and last but not least, AIA for approving our lead courses for continuing education hours. These numerous organizations are vital to the success of Intermountain Sustainability Summit and to all of us here today as we strive to make ourselves, workplaces, communities, and the state of Utah more sustainable. We encourage you to take some time today to visit with our sponsors and the many exhibitors that we have outside the doors today. And on behalf of the organizing committee, we are so grateful for their support, so let's give them all a hand for making this possible today. We also would like to take a moment to thank our summit hosts, that's Weber State University and Utah Recycling Alliance, and the support given to our planning committee by Utah Department of Environmental Quality, Intermountain Healthcare, Salt Lake County, the Weber Morgan Health Department, and also Logan City Environmental Department. And of course, we would like to thank all of you who are with us today. We hope that our summit continues to give you an excellent opportunity to learn, network, and discuss issues that are important to our environment and sustainability in general. And then just before I turn the time over to President White, we just have a few housekeeping issues to address. I'd like to remind everyone to take a look at the student poster session, and that's out the door and to the left in that direction. The students have put together a lot of great posters today, and so if everyone could take a look at those, that would be great. And also, we encourage everyone to enter a drawing that will be held at 4:30 today. So if you didn't get one of these little cards at registration, if you just fill one side with initials from the different exhibitors that are out there today, and enter it into the drawing next to the registration table. We'll be giving away some great prizes this afternoon. So without further ado, please welcome Weber State University President Chuck White. Thank you.
Thank you and welcome everybody. It's great to have you here this morning. Today, we're going to talk about some really important issues for our state: air pollution, water conservation, clean energy, and sustainable business practices, sustainable practices in general. Weber State is really serious about these things, and over the last 5 years, we have reduced our power consumption by nearly 1/3, while at the same time increasing the space in our buildings by about 10%. But action goes beyond energy reduction. We have a new sustainability practices and research center that will connect our faculty and staff who study and work on sustainability issues, and Dr. Alice Mulder will direct that center. And yet, yeah, Alice. And yet, despite all of our attention to these issues, I can't help but wonder if we don't have a collective sense of amnesia when it comes to sustainability. When we have fewer red days, as we've had this year, do we forget that the problem still looms and it'll come back to revisit us year after year after year if we don't do something substantial about it? This year, there hasn't been the same sense of urgency about air pollution as there was just last year when the inversions were so severe. Instead, the discussion of this year is more about water and whether we'll have enough of the stuff to pour onto our lush green lawns in August. There are two big parts to this sustainability issue. The first part deals with depletion of resources and the creation of pollution. These obviously threaten our environment and our very lives. The second part, though, is just as important. It's about how we humans think about, or sometimes not think about, these issues. Our next speaker is here to help us better understand the psychology behind sustainability, and it's my pleasure to introduce him. P. Wesley Schultz is professor of psychology at Cal State San Marcos. Professor Schultz, who currently serves as the interim dean of graduate studies and associate vice president for research, is an expert in the areas of social influence and behavioral change. His work examines the psychology of climate change, as well as doing cross-cultural research on environmental attitudes. Professor Schultz has written and edited 7 books and has published more than 50 peer-reviewed journal articles. He's given more than 100 presentations at scientific meetings, universities, and private organizations around the world, including countries like England, Australia, Canada, Germany, Greece, Italy, Singapore, Spain, and the Netherlands. He's trained and consulted with many public and private organizations, and he's here today to share his experience with us. Please join me in a warm Weber State welcome to Wesley Schultz.
Uh-oh. All right, help is on the way. All right, good morning. Well, absent any slides, I can just freelance it a bit. Thank you for the kind introduction. And I am here to talk about the solution. So I'm a professor. I teach courses in psychology, social psychology, statistics, quantitative methods, environmental psychology. And in my university position, it's very easy to be critical, to point out these are all of the things that we're doing that are causing the problems, and to highlight the behaviors that are associated with these different sustainability issues. And my students challenged me. They said, well, it's easy to be critical, but what would you do, right? What's the solution? Do it better. If you are so knowledgeable in the science of behavior, how would you do it? And so I embarked on a program of research looking at positive solutions. How can we effectively change behavior to respond to some of these environmental and sustainability issues? So my talk today is about behavior. And the title is Conservation Means Behavior, Lessons from Behavioral Science. And a lot of times when we talk about sustainability, we talk about environmental issues, we don't see it as a behavioral issue. I have a bunch of resources. A lot of this material is drawn from a recent book that I co-wrote with a colleague of mine, Doug McKinsey-Moore, and a couple others, called Social Marketing to Protect the Environment. So trying to draw on the behavioral sciences to create more effective programs. But the starting point for this talk is that conservation means behavior. And when we talk about environmental problems, the human link, the behavioral link, is the primary cause of these. Whether we're talking about climate change, talking about pollution, we're talking about depletion of natural resources, whatever the issue is, that the behavior is the cause of it. And so changing behavior then is central to a sustainable future. But how do we change behavior? And I've listed here a couple of the dominant approaches. One of the main responses we hear, at least in the US and in Western cultures, is technology. Technology is going to save us. So if we have energy issues, we just need to discover some new technology that will provide more energy in a more efficient way. But that's risky, right? What happens if we don't? What happens if the new technology doesn't emerge? We're putting all of our hopes into some new discovery, and we're not investing in alternatives that are sure to produce an outcome. Policy and law. So we need to regulate it. Certainly there's an important place for policy and law, but these things take time. They're oftentimes very contentious. And you can't regulate every behavior. You can't regulate every action in every context. Structural investments, again, very expensive, oftentimes contentious, and it takes a long time. We need solutions that we can apply now. So the fourth one here is to encourage voluntary actions. People should just choose to do it. And most of the environmental programs, conservation programs that we see focus on this voluntary action. So how do we get people to choose the right behavior? Well, we should educate them. This is one of the main strategies, right? People don't do the right thing, right being defined by ourselves, because they just don't know. Well, what that means is they don't know what I know. So if I educate them about what I know, then certainly they would choose the right action. But time and again, we see in the research that education does not produce the changes in behavior that we would expect. We know that we should do many different things. I know that I should exercise every day, but I don't do it. There's another process that we're missing there, that education is not the solution. We need to raise awareness about these important issues is another one. We need to highlight self-interest, that if you do this, you're going to save money, for example. We need to scare people. That'll do it, right? We'll really scare them into the right action. But the theme across many of these approaches is that most people are doing the wrong thing. That's the message that we're sending. Most people do the wrong thing, but you should be different. You should be the solution. Well, that's hard. That means being weird. Most people are doing this undesirable thing. Most people have grass in their front yard. It's not a sustainable action. So should I put rocks in mine? What's that going to do to my property value? What are people going to think of me if I do this action? So we're highlighting the fact that choosing the sustainable solution is the deviant one. And I think that message is not the strongest. So just a little bit more about knowledge and awareness, because these are two strategies that are widely used. One is that if people know what to do, then they'll surely do it. And over again across not just sustainability areas, but also in health and in safety and so forth, we find that knowledge does not result in behavior change. With raising awareness, if people know the severity of it, then they'll certainly change. And in the research, we find that attitudes, that is believing that it's an important action or believing that it's an important issue, is not linked with behavior change. But yet we continue to see these things. Together for a Green Europe, environmental education approach. Beach Environmental Awareness Campaign. Energy Awareness Month. All right, so what I want to do now is move a little bit to talk about barriers to conservation, and I've picked 3 here. And for each of them to talk about the barrier and then talk about a potential solution. And the 3 that I've highlighted come from my own research. One is on biased perceptions, second is on connectedness with nature, and third is on social norms. Now tomorrow, on Friday, I'm doing a full one-day workshop that will take these and add to it many others and build toward a toolkit that can be applied to creating behavior change programs, sustainability programs. But I'm going to highlight these 3. All right, so first, biased perceptions. We know from behavioral science, from psychology, from behavioral economics, human cognition is not particularly rational. In psychology, we talk about it as motivated social cognition. We're biased to perceive and see things that reflect well on us. If things are scary, we tend to interpret them in a way that makes our world seem safer. We engage in these self-enhancement strategies so that as a result of how we process information and perceive things, the world seems safe for us. So when we look at people's perceptions of environmental issues, we can compare what they see with regard to broader issues worldwide versus local issues. So here's a question for you. In your community, how serious are each of the following problems? And we'll just rate it on a scale from 1, not at all, to 4, extremely. So just think for yourself. All right, deforestation. You do have trees here, I've seen them. Water pollution, air pollution, land pollution, overpopulation, climate change, or global warming. And I've asked this question of thousands and thousands of people. Now that if you think about the issues from a global perspective rather than a local one, how serious are each of the following environmental problems? Same list, same scale. What we consistently find is that the problems are rated as worse at the local level, rated as worse at the global level than at the local level. That is, these problems are important, they're big, but they're somewhere else. They're not here in Ogden, Utah. They're not here in the western United States. In fact, in the US in general, they're not really here. They're someplace else. All right, and you say, well, maybe there's some truth to that. You know, we have a lot of laws, we've had a long history of environmental protection, so maybe there's some truth to it. But we find this in a variety of different samples. We find it in school children, we find it in college students, we find it in general samples in the US, and we find it in international samples. So if we look at countries all around the world, and I have 30 samples that I've looked at so far, consistently in 29 of the 30. There was one outlier, and I'll point that out in just a minute. But consistently, we find that even in countries that have a high degree of environmental degradation, we find this disparity between perceptions globally and perceptions locally. Even in places where it's bad, people say it's worse elsewhere. Yeah, okay, it's bad here, but it's worse someplace else. So there's this perception that the problems we face are not localized. They're not directly affecting me. And if you think back to that motivated social cognition, that biased perception, if it doesn't affect me, I'm probably not going to take action. So this graph just shows the 30 samples that I mentioned from the international data set, and looking at global versus local, so what we're calling spatial bias here. And we've looked at other types of bias in this, temporal bias, for example. Environmental problems aren't bad now, but they will be in the future, right? So you can have these temporal type of effects, or there's a variety of other biases that you can look at. But this is a spatial bias effect. So this is the difference between perceptions of local versus global. And I've plotted this as a function of the sustainability level of the country, so using this environmental sustainability index. So I said that there may be some truth to it, right? If we say, well, it's not so bad here in the US because we have all of these protections and laws and history and so forth. And there is some evidence that countries that have more degradation, that is, they're lower on this environmental sustainability index, perceive the issue as more important or a bigger problem locally. But they still have the bias. And so what this shows here, the top is plotted as a function of our data. The degree of bias, 0 there meaning no bias, I would perceive it as equally problematic locally and globally. So if it's above 0, it means I perceive it as worse globally than locally. And consistently we find that. And the black one represents what it should be, what the perception should be based on the Environmental Sustainability Index, this international index that's calculated based on a number of different criteria of the country. So some countries, a number of them, should say, no, it's worse here than it is globally, because it is. But almost never do we see that. Consistently, we find this gap, this bias between what it is and what they perceive it to be. All right, moving to number 2 here. Separate from nature. So if you think back to your childhood, and I say you, I look out, most of you are, similar in age to me, some a little older, some a little younger, but as I think back to my childhood, we spent time outdoors. These are the black and white pictures. We didn't have color pictures back in my day, right? We spent time outdoors. We played in the sprinklers. We smelled the flowers, right? And on the right side, kids today, they don't go outside, right? Kids today, they play on their video games, they watch television, that their experiences as children are dramatically different than the experiences of previous generations. And that those experiences may disconnect them from nature. They might not have that sense of place, that sense of belonging, that sense of I'm part of nature, and therefore I need to protect nature in order to protect myself. So we've launched a series of studies, a program of research looking at this idea of connectedness with nature, and we've defined it as an individual's belief about the extent to which he or she is part of nature. Am I part of the natural environment, or am I separate from it? We find over and over that a person's perception of their connectedness is associated with higher levels of environmental behavior, of conservation. People who see themselves as connected with nature are more likely to engage in conservation actions. We also find that connectedness can be changed through experience, but not just any experience. It's not enough to just be outside. It has to do with the type of action, the type of experience that you have, particularly sensory experiences, immersion experiences, or perspective-taking activities. And I'll give you a couple examples. So this was a study that was done by a German colleague of mine, and they had a week-long program where they took German school kids to a field station. And the kids stayed in a big bunkhouse, but as part of the experience in this field station, they would do activities outside. They would classify, for example, the different reptiles that they would find outside. They would do sensory experiences that involve taking your shoes off and playing in the grass or walking through a stream. So they had both formal and informal activities, and so an example of an informal activity, walking barefoot and blindfolded through shallow water, but they also had sort of formal science activities, catching and labeling aquatic animals. And so it was a whole program of educational experiences that were linked with this. And they used this measure that we had developed called the inclusion of nature and self scale. So you just ask people, to what extent are you part of the natural environment? So it's a graphical image, works with kids, works with adults. So you have you, self, and nature. And so in version A here, the two are completely separate. Nature is here, and I'm here. And in version G, nature and me are completely aligned and overlapped. And then you can choose anywhere along the way. This one's easy to administer. We have other measures of connectedness, which I'll mention in a minute. And so they administered this to the kids at the beginning as a pretest, partway through the program, and then as a follow-up after the program. And what they found is, as a result of being in this immersion experience at this field station, they were able to increase the children's connectedness with nature over time. We have a lot of other examples working with zoos, working with natural parks that do similar types of things, and in essence show that by structuring experiences, you are able to increase connectedness. But maybe this connectedness is more implicit, right? That measure that I described where we ask people. Yeah, okay, sometimes people think psychology is just about asking people, what do you believe? But can we measure it in a more implicit way? So we've created a game. We call it Flexi Twins. And the game can be played online. If you go to flexitwins.com, we've posted it up. There's an iPad version that's available. And it's a classification game. You can do it with kids, you can do it with adults. And so What it does is it measures your reaction time, how quickly you can make classifications of natural words or images, built words or images, and also how quickly you can classify your own name or your own image versus other names and other images. And so we're able to use this cognitive test to measure the strength of the association that a person has between self and nature. We've used this in a variety of different contexts. This is some kids that are playing on the iPad version of it. And we partnered with the Forest Service to look at, can we promote connectedness through some of the hikes that they have highlighted in different parts of their service territory. And they asked another question. We're having a hard time getting kids to go there. And so can we bring it to them? Can we bring the nature experience into the classroom? So what they've done is created a virtual hike. So there's a physical hike that's out there, Mount Laguna, and there's a path, and the top left image there are some kids that are on this path. And so it's about a half an hour hike, and the kids can go out, and then there's a little nature center and so forth. But almost no one goes there. They have a hard time getting kids to go out there. So they took that same hike, and they digitized it. They walked through, they took video, pictures, they posted it up online so that kids now can go and have this virtual hiking experience. Can we take nature and bring it to the kid in an online form? And so here at the bottom, we have this Natural Treasures hike, and it's the exact same hike. So what we did is we tested it. We took a group of kids out to the real hike. We went on the hike, measured their implicit connectedness with nature, and then brought the hike into the classrooms and let a separate group of kids do the hike in the classrooms. We wanted to see, can we change connectedness? So this is the virtual hike experience. Here they are, hiking. Our results were pretty clear. The in-person hike resulted in immediate increase in connectedness. We were using that implicit measure, the game version. The virtual hike did not result in an increase in connectedness. There's something about being in that natural environment that's different, that can't be, at least not using the technology that we have now, that can't be replicated. Now you could argue, okay, if we use Oculus and we have VR technology, can we completely recreate it? I don't know, right? Our study was about this type of technology as it exists today. We did test some other types of activities, and one of them that worked in promoting connectedness was a school-based calendar contest where kids went out into their backyards, into their local communities, and this program was called Get to Know Your Wild Neighbors. And they found natural artifacts, sticks, rocks, leaves that they could bring back inside and create then a piece of art that was associated with it. A drawing, a picture, a poem, a story, something that was related to it, and then submit that to an art contest. And the kids who were part of that, who did participate, had an increase in connectedness. Now, this idea of connectedness, I think, is not just an abstract concept. And a lot of organizations have defined themselves as connecting people to nature. This is what they do. So this is the San Diego Zoo, my home-based zoo. The Zoological Society of San Diego says our vision is to become a world leader at connecting people to wildlife and to conservation, that connecting piece of it. Interestingly, with the San Diego Zoo and with other zoos, we find that as a result of spending a day at the zoo, we do see an increase in connectedness. That experience increases the person's sense of connectedness with nature, again, using that implicit measure. All right, number 3, social norms. So in my introduction, I mentioned that oftentimes conservation is presented as something that very few people do, that the norm is not to engage in conservation. Most people are doing the wrong thing. But could we turn that around? right? If we say, well, that's probably not a very effective message, could we flip it? Could we make conservation the norm? So this picture just shows photovoltaic panels, and obviously this is a community that decided to adopt the photovoltaic panels collectively. But there was a good paper that came out just this year that showed that the strongest predictor of whether or not a person will install photovoltaic panels on their roof, the solar panels on their roof, is not income, it's not education, it's not geography, it's the distance that you are from someone else who has photovoltaics on their roof. That pressure, that norm, other people are doing it, is the strongest predictor. But yet we continue to see messages and programs that highlight the fact that lots of people don't do conservation. So here's one about cigarette butt disposal. So here's a dirty secret. 48% of Tennesseans polled say they have knowingly thrown trash on the street. About 1 in 5 say they do this on a regular basis. Well, first you look at that and you say, that's a big problem. But then you say, well, if I'm a smoker, well, okay, that's what everybody does, right? That's the norm. Here's an example from water conservation. Now, I'm not going to pull up the video. This was a 60-second public service announcement that was created by the San Diego County Water Authority, and I'm sure you have similar public service announcements here in the Salt Lake region, given the water issues that you face. But the message was something like this. It began with that top left panel of a single house with some grass and a sprinkler, and you hear ch, 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 ch. And then in Google Earth fashion, it zooms out, and you see that panel on the right, a whole neighborhood, and you hear a collective ch, 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 right, the sprinklers. Then it zooms out again, and the noise gets louder and louder and louder, and then it says, water, save it or lose it. Now, the message is, everybody's got the sprinklers, right? The message is, this is the norm, rather than the message being, the norm is not to have the grass. So let me present how we might switch this norm-based message, fighting the social norm. So implicit in many environmental programs is the message that most people do the wrong thing. In psychology and behavioral science, we talk about social norms as an individual's beliefs about the common and accepted behavior among group members. It's their belief. That's an important piece of it. It resides in their head. It's not necessarily truth. But if you present the norm that no one is doing the behavior that you're trying to promote, it leads to helplessness. It leads to low self-efficacy. Better to show the reverse, which is that conservation is the norm. So here's a project that we did at the Carlsbad Inn Beach Resort, a local hotel and timeshare facility in Carlsbad. And if you've stayed recently in hotel rooms, my hotel room here, the Ben Lomond Hotel, has a message that looks very similar to this one. They encourage you to reuse your towels. So this says, help us conserve our natural resources. Do you need fresh towels? If you'd like your towels replaced, please leave your used towel in the basket. Towels left hanging on the rack tell us that you wish to reuse them. And then it has an environmental message. Using towels more than once, save hundreds of pounds of detergent and thousands of gallons of water each year. And these types of environmental appeals typically don't produce very strong changes in behavior. The people who respond to these environmental appeals already do those things. So we wanted to create an alternative. Our alternative message said this: many of our guests have expressed to us their approval of conserving energy. When given the opportunity, nearly 75% of hotel guests choose to reuse their towels each day. Because so many guests value conservation and are in the habit of conserving, this hotel has initiated a conservation program. In essence, the guests who stay here demanded it. We, the management, oh, okay, we don't really care either way, but the guests demanded it. 75% of guests choose to reuse their towels each day. We put these messages in the hotel rooms, and we put them in close proximity to the towel. Oftentimes, these messages are placed somewhere else. They're placed where you come into the room, or they're even placed in the lobby. So we placed it in close proximity to the towel. And you can see here it was just an in-room placard. We then worked with the cleaning staff to count how many towels came out of the room each day. Now you can think about the excitement of doing environmental psychology, right? As being part of the environmental psychology lab at Cal State. You can work with the cleaning staff to count these dirty towels as they come out of rooms. But we did, we counted them. And we compared then rooms that had our message with randomly assigned rooms that had that old message with the straight environmental appeal, the control message. What we found is that the rooms with our message had 25% fewer towels that came out on those cleaning days. A 25% reduction by changing that basis to a social norm foundation. All right, another example. When California faced our energy crisis about 10 years ago, we wanted to see if we could use this social norms approach to encourage residential energy conservation. We started by doing a survey of people in the region to find out why they would conserve energy. What we found was that the number one thing people told us was environmental protection. I conserve energy to protect the environment. Number two, save money. Number three, social responsibility. We then created a messaging campaign that highlighted those different reasons for conservation. And we added a fourth one, and that fourth one was the social norms message. When we ask people if they conserve because other people are conserving, they say no. I don't care what other people do. I do my own thing, right? I'm not affected by them. I'll come back to that point in a minute because it's an interesting cross-cultural effect there. So we created the norms-based message, again, to highlight the social approval and the commonness of these behaviors. So join your neighbors in conserving energy. Summer is here, and most San Marcos residents are finding ways to conserve energy at home. How? And then we had 4 successive messages. This one says, by using fans instead of air conditioning. So we're highlighting a behavior that has a big impact on electricity consumption. And we say, according to a recent telephone survey conducted by Cal State San Marcos, that was us, that was the survey I mentioned where we asked people why they conserve, 77% of San Marcos residents said that they often use fans instead of air conditioning to keep cool in the summer. Using fans instead of air conditioning, the San Marcos popular choice. And we compared this to the other messages and also to a control message that just encouraged people to use fans instead of air conditioning but didn't give them any reason. We then went from house to house and we read the electricity meters. Now, I'll skip all the details of that, but we know how much each household used in terms of kilowatts. And we looked at average daily energy consumption while we distributed these messages. And we contrasted the self-interest, saving money, social responsibility, descriptive norm, environmental appeal, and then the information only, which was our control. The only message that resulted in a reduction in consumption was the norms-based message. Appealing to self-interest, and I should point out appealing. We didn't actually change the cost structure. I think you can get some good effects if you change the cost structure. We just appealed to self-interest by saying this is how much you could save if you did these different behaviors. And I think there's a lot of creative ways that we can incorporate this conservation norm into our messages. So this is the Keep America Beautiful. They sponsor the America Recycles Day. And what you can see here is that they're asking people to take a pledge, but as part of their pledge, they're highlighting the large number of people who have also taken that pledge. So 6,984 people have signed this pledge. And then here they are, right? Here's their names. All right, so just some concluding thoughts here. knowledge and awareness are important, but the research is very clear that they don't lead to changes in behavior. If we're trying to promote specific actions, education and raising awareness aren't going to get us there. I think they can provide a basic platform for some of these messages, but we can't expect that it's going to result in the changes. I've highlighted here 3 barriers to environmental action, and that was biased perception, seeing environmental problems as worse globally than locally, so it's not something that's going to affect me. That there's a lack of connectedness with nature, part of a result of a generational change, and this idea of social norms. So as I mentioned on Friday, tomorrow, I'll be hosting a one-day workshop on behavior change, social marketing and behavior change. And we'll highlight some of these barriers and also other strategies, some tools that can be used for program design and to promote conservation. I have a number of references, and if you're interested, I'm happy to send them over to you if you just want to send me an email and I can zip you a PDF of any of the files. So, with that, thank you very much. I think we've allowed a couple minutes for questions.
I'm going to walk around with the microphone so everybody can hear what your questions are, and we'll start. We got a few minutes here.
You mentioned one of the countries was an outlier.
Oh, yeah. So let's go, I'll go back here. So here's our graph, and you can see the line that I had talked about, 0 being no bias, no difference between perceptions of local and global. Above the line, most of the countries you can see are above the line, but there's one that's below the line, and that's a Romanian sample. Why would Romanian people perceive that the environmental problems locally are worse than they are globally, and other countries don't? I'm not sure. It could be an anomalous finding. We don't have any additional data from Romania, but at least there was one country out of the 30 where the sample came in actually slightly below where we would have expected based on the level of degradation that was there. If anybody has experience in Romania, maybe they can say some speculation.
I just had a question about your study with the children on the virtual hike versus the real hike. How did you measure their connectedness after?
So on that one, we used the Flexi-Twins measure, what we call implicit connectedness with nature, which is a reaction time based measure. And so what happens is the kids see on the iPad an image, and it can be a natural image or a built image. So for example, a picture of a house or a picture of a duck. And they have to decide, is it natural or is it built? And then they see pictures of themselves or pictures of other people, and they have to decide, is that me or is that someone else? So the procedure is drawn from work by a couple faculty member at Harvard and at the University of Washington called the implicit associations test. And so you can measure the strength of cognitive associations between any particular categories. It's used for products, it's used for politics in a variety of different ways. We've adapted it and created a game interface so that we can measure strength of connections between self and nature. It's available online. If you have your laptop and you go to flexitwins.com, you can play it, and it will actually give you your score. It will tell you the strength of your implicit connectedness with nature.
I really appreciate how you brought up the difference between people having like a spatial bias perception and then the temporal bias as well. And something that I wonder is, did you consider how, like when you ask participants of a survey, like how connected are you to nature? That sounds like a spatially biased question. Is that something that is considered like when you're conducting these kinds of surveys?
Yeah, so you're actually putting the two pieces together, right? So you're saying, well, can we predict bias? So is a person who has a strong sense of connectedness with nature, will they be less biased? Or maybe would they be more biased? We have looked at that, and surprisingly, connectedness does not predict bias. Other things predict bias. For example, people who are happier tend to have more bias than people who are less happy, unhappy. And one of the things we argue is that by limiting the number of threats that you perceive directly to you, it improves your well-being, your sense of well-being, your sense of safety, your sense of comfort, and reduces the degree of threat. So sort of this emotional foundation, but to your point about are people who are more connected with nature less biased, we don't find any evidence for that. Even people who are strongly connected still show this sense of spatial bias.
More questions?
I think there's a question.
Yeah, there's one over
a
there.
couple in front.
Since the examples you gave were all directed towards changing the behavior of individuals, and our Supreme Court has told us now that corporations have the right of individuals, do you think that there's a way to extrapolate these findings into like corporate social responsibility and sort of combating the groupthink that can happen when you take a group instead of an individual and want to change their behavior?
Yeah, so the question is, can we use some of these principles and apply it to corporate change, right? So that we can promote sustainable practices within a particular business. And you can think about all sorts of things. So adopting efficient technologies, you could think about behavioral strategies in the workplace, purchasing recycled content, on and on, right? We have looked at that. One of the things that we find with corporations is that they're driven primarily out of self-interest. And you could argue that individuals are also driven by self-interest, but remember, one of my opening pieces was, well, individuals aren't rational. A lot of times we choose actions that aren't in our best self-interest. So we actually find that corporations and businesses are better at behaving in a purely self-interested way than are individuals. Not that they're immune to some of these biases, but that they're really driven by, is it going to affect our bottom line, right? Are we going to be able to generate more profit? Are we going to be able to act more efficiently, to be more competitive, and so forth? One of the things we find that does seem to work for corporate entities, and these are for-profit entities, is their public perception. That they see their brand as critical to their success. So if they can adopt a sustainable practice and to link that with their brand and attract more business and more market share, that's really appealing to them. But you have to be able to show that there's that link, right? To be able to highlight and publicize the fact that the sustainable actions that the company is taking is being shown in their brand, is being reflected back to their customers. But that does seem to work.
A quick question, a comment. I imagine that behavioral economics at the University of Chicago is kind of the mother lode of all of that.
Let me comment on that one.
All right. But the thing that I think the attendees would enjoy, and I'm sure you've read the book called Nudge, just simply called Nudge, which I think is a fantastic book for all of us in so many different ways. That's it.
So let me comment on Nudge. I agree that Nudge was a fantastic book, and in fact, a lot of the work that I've talked about and a lot of my work was highlighted in that book, which I appreciate. But we need more than a nudge, right? A nudge is like a bump, a push. We don't need to nudge people. We need to change people. And so I'd like to see the next step be not nudge, but pull, tug, right? Something more substantial than nudge. And I think what Nudge has done is highlighted some of the behavioral economics that can be used to promote conservation and sustainable behaviors. But I think we can do much more than that. And I think the next iteration, Nudge 2.0, if you will, is really going to be about creating more substantial changes. And I think what they've done is that initial step. But there's a lot of behavioral economics and a lot of social psychology that can be used for more substantial change. Interestingly, the UK created, in essence, a department of nudges, right? They created a national entity that does exactly that, that tries to incorporate behavioral economics into some of these social programs nationally. And finally, to your point about the University of Chicago and behavioral economics, definitely the University of Chicago is the leading institution for the behavioral economics research. But what we're talking about with behavioral economics is just renaming social psychology. It's like the economists finally realized after, I don't know how many years, 50 years, maybe if you go back further, 100 years, that economic decisions aren't purely rational, right? Traditional economics is based on this rational model of people pursuing their self-interest, trying to maximize their self-interest, a competitive environment where that can happen. But what happens if people aren't rational in pursuing their self-interest? Well, now the traditional economic models begin to break down. A lot of those assumptions don't hold. And so what they're calling behavioral economics is really just social psychology rebranded to say, oh, hey, people aren't rational, and what happens if they're not to their economic decisions? So on the one hand, it sounds great. Yes, University of Chicago, behavioral economics, and I apologize if somebody's here from Chicago. But I think they're just rebranding a large body of research that's already got a substantial number of findings in it. But I'm happy to see it, and I'm happy to see that policymakers are now looking at, because if you call it economics, policy people are interested in it. If you call it psychology, they're like, oh, yeah, we're not so interested in that. So behavioral economics is really making that body of knowledge accessible and putting it into practice.
That's really all the time we have for questions. Hopefully most of you are going to join us for the conference tomorrow, the workshop tomorrow. Emily, do we have any more spots open? 5? So if you have an interest in going to that workshop tomorrow, we have 5 slots open. So first come, first serve. Please come join us. It should be a very informative day. So once again, thank you, Wes.
Thank you very much.
There's a couple reasons that we've come up to Ogden to hold this sustainability summit. The first is Weber State. They've been very supportive. They've given us all kinds of backing as far as a place to hold this and the support to run it, and it's been a great experience. The second is Ogden has been a very receptive sustainability city, and the former mayor plus our current mayor have been more than engaging as far as sustainability and outdoor life and that connectedness that we just heard about. And so it's really with our pleasure to come into this city to hold this sustainability conference. We realize that you have to drive a little bit further, but we believe it's well worth it. And so I'd like to introduce now the mayor of Ogden, Mike Caldwell, and if you'll come on up. And he's going to introduce our next speaker.
Well, thank you all for being here. I think this is a very important dialogue. I also want to thank the Intermountain Sustainability Summit for putting this on, and Weber State University, who's a key partner for so much of what we've been able to do in the last 10 years here. Third year running that Ogden City, the oldest city in Utah, has been on Forbes' fastest 20 growing cities list. And had anybody told us that was going to be the case 10, 12 years ago, we would have said, you're crazy. This is a tired, kind of worn out rail town. We don't have the room to grow. We don't have bare dirt to work from, but we've really been in a unique spot to engage in some of these future patterns and really seen some unique growth with that. And along those lines, it's a real pleasure of mine to introduce our keynote speaker today, Dr. David W. Orr. This is a pretty long resume and bio, so bear with me. This is we're very fortunate to have him here, and we appreciate him making the trip. Dr. Orr is the Paul Sears Distinguished Professor of Environmental Studies and Politics and Senior Advisor to the President, Oberlin College. He is the author of 7 books on sustainability and our environment. He has authored nearly 200 articles, reviews, book chapters, and professional publications. In the past 20 years, he has served on the board as a board member or advisor to 8 foundations on the boards of many organizations, including the Rocky Mountain Institute, the Aldo Leopold Foundation. Currently, he is the trustee of the Bioneers, Alliance for Sustainable Colorado, and the World Watch Institute. He has been awarded 7 honorary degrees and a dozen other awards, including a Lyndhurst Prize, a National Achievement Award for the National Wildlife Federation, and recently a Visionary Leadership Award from Second Nature. He's lectured at hundreds of colleges and universities throughout the U.S., Europe, and Asia. He headed the effort to design, fund, and build the Adam Joseph Lewis Center, which was named by an AIA panel in 2010 as the most important green building of the past 30 years, and as one of the 30 milestone buildings of the 20th century by the U.S. Department of Energy. He's executive director of the Oberlin Project and a founding editor of the journal Solutions. The great Wayne Gretzky said that true greatness isn't skating to where the puck is going to be, but not to where it is, but to where it's going to be. And we know where we're going to be along the Wasatch Front in the next 30 years. The governor's office has said that in the next 30 years, we're going to double our population, going from 3 million to 6 million people along the Wasatch Front. This has a tremendous potential and will impact our quality of life here in ways that we're just starting to measure. When you look at how we're going to accommodate double the number of people and mix that in with our clean air, water, jobs, transportation, and the economy, these are all interconnected. And the decisions we make today, we need to be thinking about what's going to happen in those next 30 years and how we're going to accommodate that kind of rapid growth. What we do now will dramatically impact the quality of life that we all love. We're rated as by National Geographic as one of the top 10 cities to live in part because we have recognized this unique connection to our natural resources. There aren't very many places in the United States of America where 2 rivers converge in its downtown. You have immediate access to hundreds of miles of trails, 3 world-class ski resorts. We live in a really phenomenal place, and if we don't start addressing these issues and thinking about this as we move forward, all of those things that I hold dear and that a lot of those other people hold dear and choose to live here will be gone. I can't imagine 3 million more tailpipes on our roads and in our streets. I can't imagine the economy and the number of jobs that's going to be required to support that, and we do not have the water in our dams and in our rivers and in our systems to support that. So we need to be making decisions now, looking 30 years forward and knowing that that population growth is coming. So this is a very important dialogue to be having. I absolutely celebrate this, and I want to again thank the Intermountain Sustainability Summit and Weber State for putting this on. And with no further ado, we'll get a real professional up here, and Dr. Orr, and looking forward to your comments.
Mayor Caldwell, thank you for those remarks. I mentioned to him that the best comment I ever heard from somebody who had just been elected mayor was William Buckley's comment in New York when he was asked just before the election what would he do, his first action if he were elected. And his answer was demand a recount. And that bears, I have great respect and sympathy for people who go into the political arena. And for those of you young people in the audience, this is a noble profession. It's been degraded and ridiculed a good bit in the past 30 years, but go into politics, go into public service. We need you there. Having gotten applause, I'll just quit with that. We'll go to Q&A. I want to, by the way, I thought that this was the 5th Intermountain Summit. It's actually the 6th, if I'm correct. And so this is last year's talk. The road to Montana is, and this is my next slide. There's a wonderful book called Lonesome Dove. And in Lonesome Dove, the scene is Lonesome Dove, Texas. And Lonesome Dove, Texas is a little way begone town. It's flat and it's dusty and it's nowhere and only a few people around. And these guys are sitting around in Lonesome Dove in a saloon, and in comes this guy who, kind of a slickster, and he begins talking about Montana. And Montana is everything that Lonesome Dove is not. It's lush and it's green and there's water and there's beautiful scenery and so forth. And so the guys all decide to take their cows and go to Montana. And so that's the yellow line along here, more or less. They don't have a clue where Montana is or what they have to do to get to Montana, the rivers they've got to cross, the Indian tribes that they'll have to fight, and the bears and the cougars along the way. They don't have a clue, but they're going to Montana. And the discussion about sustainability reminds me a bit of Larry McMurtry's description of Lonesome Dove and these guys going to Montana. This is going to be a long journey. And we don't have a clue yet what it's going to require us to do. You on the Front Range of the Wasatch, where you're growing rapidly, us, and I'm from the Rust Belt part of Ohio, that heartbeat of the American economy that went dead some years ago. And I'm from a different part of the world. We're trying to figure out how to grow and restabilize an economy. You're figuring out how to deal with success and this influx of people that are coming in. But we don't have a clue. And let me explain a little bit about why I think that's the case. This is a graphic taken from Nature magazine. And Nature magazine, for those of you in science, is roughly equivalent to the American journal Science. It's authoritative and so forth. What you're looking at is a description of what they call the safe operating spaces for humankind in a variety of different areas. So climate change, biodiversity, biogeochemical cycles, phosphorus, nitrogen, and so forth. You would not get into a car if there was an equivalent thing on the dashboard that told you the chances of a fatal accident are pretty good in this car over, say, the next 10 or 100 miles. You wouldn't get in that car. But this is the safe operating space, and it's diminishing very rapidly. Probably the largest issue in this is going to be climate change. And this is a projection from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change in November. Business as usual takes us to a world where a lot of things come undone. And this isn't just a matter of squiggly light bulbs and Priuses and green buildings. This is a much deeper change. Much deeper, I think, than our public discourse has picked up. And this is the last year's weather pattern, so it's been cold where we are. We've had one of the coldest winters people can remember around Ohio in the Northeast and so forth, lots of snow and so forth. But worldwide, January was the hottest January recorded since records have been kept worldwide. It doesn't much matter what happens in Ohio or the Northeast, because it's the global averages that really are worrisome. And then this is part of the issue. The quote is from David Archer, and the point of the quote is simply this. This journey to Montana is a long journey. It isn't anything quick. We're not going to solve this in a matter of 10 or 20 or 30 years. It won't be solved within the lifetime of anybody in this room. This is going to be a long journey. And you pause, and that's not what Americans like to hear. We like optimistic people, and we like people who are upbeat. And what David Archer is saying in here, once you put carbon in the atmosphere, and the carbon loading of the atmosphere, you and I as Americans are roughly, as a nation, responsible for 28% of the carbon now loading the atmosphere. And people in the third and fourth worlds who are told to be cut back on their fossil fuel consumption, they know that number. They know they weren't responsible for what's happening in the climate, but we are, much more so than they are or probably ever will be. So the point of this is that, as Archer points out, carbon in the atmosphere stays there for a long time. 10,000 years from now, give or take, something like 20 to 22% of the carbon we release today will still be active in climate. That's 10,000 years. Let's just boil that back to 1,000 and be really rosily optimistic. But it stays there a long time. That means that we've dug a deep hole. And so it isn't a matter, if you frame the question, could we power civilization by sunshine? The answer is sure. I think the technology exists. I think the economics would support that. It isn't just a matter of economics and politics, however, or economics and technology. It's a matter of leadership. This is why political leadership is going to be so critically important in making this transition. But all that does is to cap off the worst that might happen. That's simply the science. That's not my opinion. That's simply what the science is telling us. So we'll have to live with, if we were to stop emitting carbon today in the atmosphere and all other the 5 or 6 heat-trapping gases that are so powerful, we would have 1,000 years ahead of us of rising sea levels, rising temperatures, changing ecologies. 1,000 years. Now, let me stop and say this. That's just words on a screen. If I reached down here and I pulled out a, I don't know, an Uzi or something that was threatening, I'd have your attention in a way that words alone don't get your attention. We've been wired by our evolutionary past to respond to dependably loathsome threats. So if it's ugly and fast and big teeth and big claws or has names like Osama bin Laden, we're good. We're really good at that. We respond to direct threats extremely well. But this is words. This is science. It's data. We're not wired to respond to things like this in the same way. And then notice how we deal with this. People, and some of you I'm sure are thinking, God, that is so depressing. Well, yeah, it is. And the point is to say this, and this is going to be the subtext of the whole talk I've got. If you're optimistic about the human future, you don't know enough. You're not reading widely enough. You're not thinking deeply enough. If you're in despair, don't go there. That's a sin. The only rational place for you and me to be is in this sweet spot called hope. But hope is a verb with its sleeves rolled up. If you're optimistic, oh, we're going to make it, we always have in the past, and technology is so great, and so forth and so on, and you whittle down the questions to something that's manageable, like, can we power a civilization by sunshine? Yeah, we could. But now we still have to reckon with everything that we've done in the past. That safe space dashboard says we've done a lot of damage to the Earth, and now we have to begin to figure out how to turn this around. That road to Montana, that's a long journey, and there are a lot of things in that road and that trip that we don't yet know about. So what hope does, in contrast to either despair or optimism, it says if you're hopeful, you got to roll up your sleeves and you have to do something. And so the question for us and the question for me very much is what do we do? How do we take that knowledge without being paralyzed by it on one hand or by being giddy and optimistic on the other? So what do we do? All right. Here is my answer. And the background of this slide is this. Years back in the past, I was a minor part of Jimmy Carter's transition team, and we did a paper for Carter on what he asked for was the largest environmental issue his administration would face. This is before the election, but he was running ahead in the polls and eventually won by a fairly narrow margin. But so we did. And the paper was on energy policy and climate change, and that paper still reads well. To our shame as a nation, that paper still reads well. We have not acted on what was obvious and what future generations will look back on and say, that was merely the obvious things to do. You begin to cut back. You do what Americans do very well, and that is technology and efficiency. And the efficiency revolution would allow us to eliminate about half, easily half, of the amount of energy we presently consume, but we didn't do that. We went on a 30-year walkabout, and so it was morning in America again, and we went back to muscle cars and so forth. Later, worked for a foundation, and we did a paper for the next U.S. president, be it Democrat or Republican, male or female, on climate change. And the point of the paper was to say that climate change isn't just another of a long list, another item on a long list of issues that face us. It's the linchpin issue. It connects to everything else that we do. Get that right, and you begin to get foreign policy and balance of payments and air quality right and lots of other things right. But to this day, we've done a lot of things, but not nearly enough. We've offered about a 10-cent solution to a dollar problem. We've got a long way to go. And the technology, as I say, is there. The economics, and I'll get back to this later in the talk, the economics support it. It's good economics. The deeper the green solutions, the better the economics turn out to be. So the issue for us, for me personally, was what do we do? What's that road to Montana look like from this little city of Oberlin, Ohio, a little city of 10,000? I'll show you a map in just a minute. In 1995, we started an effort to design and build the first substantially green building on a U.S. college campus. And so the slide here, and this is not a great slide, but this is John Lyle, who was one of the great architects, died in 1998, but John was one of the leaders in the sustainability design movement years ago. And we pulled together as students, we opened up the process to the whole campus. We said, if you want to be part of a design effort and build a building, come on in. So we had about 250 students come into 13 different public charrettes. This is the first one that we held. And so they began to think about this. And they said, well, we want a building powered by sunshine. We're not like you all in Utah. Sunshine is still, in Ohio, where I live, a theory. We've heard of it. We have pictures of it. But it's still kind of a theory. But they wanted the building entirely powered by sunshine. And then they wanted a building that was drinking water in, drinking water out, as they said. And there are a couple ways you can get that kind of water quality. One is to put toilets in another building. Another is to ask people to be more disciplined and so forth. But all the criteria down here basically is the criteria now for what the U.S. Green Building Council calls the platinum standard of building. That's what they were asking for. The platinum standard yet, and the USGBC was still in the process of being formed. That didn't exist yet. But they said, we're going to learn in a building, and we want that building to reflect how we ought to learn. Architecture is a kind of crystallized pedagogy. Every building, every room, this room included, has a certain pedagogy. It's unspoken, unrealized, but where do the materials come from? Where does the energy come from? How did all this begin to come together? At what cost to whom and where? And the standard they set was something that's pretty tough to meet. It is that if this project, if this building causes ugliness, human or ecological, someplace else or at some later time, we can't say that that's a good building. And so if that's your standard, then you go upstream from the building to the wells and the mines and the manufacturing places where material flows start that are later crystallized in the building. And if you compromise, or we compromise, human dignity and ecological integrity upstream, you can't say that the building is good. And then downstream, if the building changes climate, toxifies the world, destroys biodiversity, you can't say that the building is good. And then that's kind of like truth, beauty, and justice. You strive to get there. We never quite get there. This is planet Earth. So anyway, that's how we started. That's the subsequent building that was built. And it's a 14,200 square foot building. An American Institute of Architects panel several years ago said that's the most important green building of the past 30 years. But for me, it's the most important green building that we've ever done at Oberlin, because of its effect on how people think, how the students thought that participated in that project. And first of all, overcoming the idea that, well, we can't do anything. We're not able to cause these kind of changes, but we did it. And so they learned to be, the word is efficacious. They learned that they could do things in the world. They could cause change. And then the idea that we came together and we reached a standard that no one yet in higher education had reached in the built environment. The building is a small building. It's 14,200 square feet, so it's not big by size. It's big by concept and impact. And there are a couple of shots of the interior of the building. The landscape around the building, which shows in this picture, is also part of the pedagogical intent of the building. But we wanted a structure that, it wasn't just a place where we held classes, but it was by the way it was built and designed and maintained and evolved over time, it became educational in all kinds of ways. So in any given year, we've got 40 or 50 or 60 students that work on various things around the building. This is the living machine. This is that drinking water in, drinking water out standard. This was designed by a great biologist and friend of mine, John Todd, and what John did in this was to essentially design an indoor wetland. So you flush a toilet, the water comes in, and then plants do what plants do. You try to maximize the exposure of the root surface to the water column. And plants take out phosphorus and nitrogen. If you design this more advanced models, you can detoxify toxics and you can sequester heavy metals and so forth. We wanted the building to be a structure that monitored itself in real time. So we ran a class with the National Renewable Energy Lab. 3 of the students that were in that class in 2001 left Oberlin to form a high-performance building monitoring company called Lucid Designs, and they're one of the hot companies in this whole field. I think for me, they're the trendsetter, but they wired the building up so everything, 160 data sensors in the building, and everything is wired up. They claim that when faculty in their offices flatline or go to sleep, they can detect it. But what do they know? This is a building performance. I want to make a point here about the way buildings work. The lines here, this is, the important lines here are down these 3 years right here, the last 3 years. We didn't break even, although the building was capable of providing all of its own power from sunshine. We didn't break even until 3 years ago. These years tell you a whole lot about the management of physical plant. So think of a maintenance crew that is maintaining a fleet of typewriters on a campus. And to maintain a typewriter, you need a ribbon change and a drop of oil from time to time, and that works just fine. But now think of what those people do when they're given notebook computers. Both technologies turn out sheets of paper with symbols on them. But one takes a drop of oil and a ribbon change. The other, which is not a mechanical device per se, takes software changes and hardware changes and networking and so forth. So now think of buildings like this. This is a network computer kind of building. It's a high-performance structure. And until we learned as a physical plant how to manage that particular artifact, we didn't do very well, or we did less than we should have done. So last year, which is a pretty cold winter in Ohio, colder than the average by far for the past 40 years, the building provided 136% of its energy needs from sunshine. Now remember, we're in Ohio, sunshine's still a theory, but the technology works. and it works cost effectively. Let me kick it up to another level. That's just one building, but what that did for us was to give us a template, kind of a desk lab scale model of what it was possible to do in architectural design. And so the question came up a few years later, about 2000, 2007, 8, 9. We began to talk about taking that model up to the next scale. And once again, as we did with the Lewis Center, engaging students in the process of rethinking this little community. So this is the town of Oberlin. This is where Elaine and I live. A town of roughly 10,000, give or take. We're about 14 miles from Lake Erie. We're 83 miles on a straight line to Detroit, 35 from Cleveland. And what we did was to start a community, city, college joint endeavor to make this a model of sustainability. Now, the reason for this, and the reason why architects are so important in all of this process is, about 70% of our sensory apparatus is connected to our eyes. So we're inclined to believe what we can see, touch, feel, experience. The reverse may also be true, but for the time being, just focus on that. So sight is important to us. And sustainability, this journey to Montana, is always going to be an abstraction until we can begin to see the parts of it in action at a system scale. So could you take a little town in Ohio, Rust Belt town, we have a poverty level of 28%. We're not wealthy. To all appearances notwithstanding, we are a poor city. So we said, let's do 5 things. Let's first of all develop the downtown economy. The college owned a 13-acre block in the downtown. You'll see that in just a moment. And let's use that block as the driver for local economic renewal. So that was number 1. Number 2 was to get the city and the college both to climate neutrality, or climate, a terrible word, positivity, make more energy than you actually use. The third is to begin to use the green belt around us. We're in a kind of a schizophrenic area. The northern part of our county is industrial. A lot of it's faded out. The southern half is agricultural. A lot of that's corn, soybeans, and highly subsidized. But could we begin to grow, let's say, 70% of our food locally within maybe a 10 or 15 or 20 mile radius in that farm country? Because we're not going to be importing food. If you go back to that climate change slide, the years of California export agriculture are coming to a close. Rainfall is going to be the big factor. Heat is going to be a major factor also. And so the idea that we're going to import food at a volume we need, at a price we could afford from long distances, that's not going to be there. Fourth item, could we remake the city and do it in a way that connected with young people? Could we do this the way we did the Lewis Center and have, let's say, 1,000 students from a variety of the colleges, public schools, and so forth work on sustainability and work with a team of engineers and architects and urban planners and designers and so forth? So when they leave the process, they have a model, they have a mental image of what courageous, smart people do in a world to change the world. And then the final thing I'll get to a little bit later. Now, conceptually, 2 slides. One is that what we've done in the sustainability movement, if you unpack this and take it apart, we have a renewable energy movement, we have a sustainable ag movement, we have a sustainable forestry movement, we have an urban green movement. So we've taken these things and we've siloed them as effectively as we ever siloed disciplines in the academy. And the point here is to begin to think beyond silos. How do we begin to connect these things? So as Aldo Leopold, the great naturalist, said, how do we begin to think at right angles to our field of specialization? That's not an argument against specialization, but it's just to say that now we need systems view of how things work. This is an organization chart of how we have kind of organized the community. Poverty eradication is one of our big goals. Can we do that also while we learn to power the city by sunshine, rebuild city housing to roughly the German passive house standard? Can we begin to combine the sustainability, technology, and capacities with social justice and fairness? And the answer, we think, is yes. This is a summary of an article that the great Donella Meadows, who died way too soon in life, did shortly before she died. It's called Leverage Points. And you can Google Leverage Points Meadows and you'll get the whole article. And what we did was to pass out copies of this for a community-wide discussion. About 200 and some people engaged in this. And the point was to begin to think about how do you change systems. In our case, the system called Oberlin. So what she does here is, and this is not scriptural, but what she does here is to take the least effective ways to change, most of which basically slow the damage. but these are where we argue about politics and so forth and subsidies and codes, standards and so forth. The most effective way, you want to change things. You get down here, you change worldviews. So the goals of the system, mindset, worldviews, paradigms, and so forth. Now, you can quarrel with the way she did this. Our point was not to give this out as scriptural, but to get the people thinking, if you want to be effective, you got to go beyond recycling. That's important to do, but that's only a small part of a much bigger vision. Now we have to begin to think of how you take these things to scale. How do you change systems? And I don't care whether the system is called the Pentagon or General Motors or Oberlin, Ohio or Harvard University. It doesn't much matter. It's how do you change systems? You and I will be embedded in systems of one kind or another for all our lives. How do we change them? Where do we intervene? Now, the point here was to get our community beginning to think about where do you intervene in this system called Oberlin, Ohio, or the system called Oberlin College. You want to change it, begin to recalibrate the way we work with the way the earth works as a physical system. So it's not scriptural, but it's a way to get people thinking. For us, the starting point in the whole process was what we called now the Green Arts District. And this is a Google map. This is the Allen Arts Museum. This particular building, it was done by the very famous American architect Cass Gilbert in 1917. It's an art museum. It's ranked generally, depending on who you read, 3rd, 4th, 5th, 6th in American higher education as an art museum. This has been redone at the LEED Gold level, which is quite an accomplishment because art museums are very tricky things to do. This is a performing arts center, which we'll redo at about a cost of $25 million. That has not yet happened. This is before we began to work on it, was the world's worst hotel. And my boss, the president of the college, is an attorney. And I once said with him sitting right in front of me, I once said that this particular hotel, built in 1955 as a motor inn to 1955 standards of aesthetics and performance, this was a plausible excuse for limited nuclear war. And the attorney in him came out, he said later, David, don't talk like that. You can't say it anymore. So I don't say that anymore. I've taken that out. But this was the cork in the bottle for us, not for everybody, but this for us was the cork in the bottle. You had to change that particular structure. So it wasn't build it and they will come. It was they already come, but they got no good place to stay. You've got a great conservatory of music, great art, great performances, great little college. You're 35 minutes from a good airport. This isn't build it and they will come. They already arrived there. They got a lousy place to stay. So this is the Reed-Made district, and down here, this is what we're working on right now. This is a hotel and conference center, and this will be, again, in a place where sunshine's a theory, this will be the first entirely solar-powered hotel conference center in the United States, I think in the world. It will open later this year. It will be part of a complex, and here I want to go back and make another point. A good bit of the dialogue, as you gather, and you participate in, and I certainly do, about sustainability is pretty damn depressing because it isn't where we're going. We're starting to realize that Montana is a long way off there, but we haven't really talked much about that. But as we think about this journey, we've got to think about the journey in a very different kind of way. And so can we make the journey a celebration? Turns out that our assets and your assets here would lend itself to all kinds of celebrations to bring art and music and poetry and culture together. My granddaughter, one of my 3 granddaughters, told me when she was about 8, after a talk, she was holding her pet giraffe. And she came up afterwards and she said, Granddad, I really liked your talk, but my pet giraffe, she had a name for it, George or whatever, thought it was really boring. That's when we took her out of the will. But she's right. People like me tend to be boring. We talk of science and parts per million, parts per billion, and politics and so forth. That's pretty boring to most people. Can we make sustainability, since we're visual creatures, can we make it part of the experiential? It's just what we do. We have parties. No, by the way, they're solar powered, and the beer, whatever, is grown from local hops and so forth. Can we begin to have sustainability as part of a celebration? That's the point we want to make here with this. This is the hotel that is planned. Again, it'll be entirely solar powered the day it operates, the day it opens. This was a construction site long about late September. They dug a big, big hole. It's a 105,000 square foot building. This was the construction site last week. They're up out of the ground. Steel is going up. And these guys were putting steel down at -5 degrees. It put my work as a professor and an academic and so forth in a whole different context. I don't work below 5 degrees. Some say I don't work at all. But anyway, this is the building going up. Across the street is one of the most extraordinary things that we've done. 3 students got together in the early part of the last decade and decided to stay in town. They were part of the crowd that failed to launch an academic. They stayed local after they graduated. They, by hook and crook, it's a long story, put together $17 million to build 3 buildings. Locally, the top buildings here are 33 condominiums, and the bottom is commercial space. So these are condominiums. The bottom is commercial space. This is the coffee shop that is the place to go, the little coffee shop wine bar that has entertainment and performances in the evening. But again, sustainability. This came in at the LEED Gold level. These were 3 students. You don't have to wait till you're my age or 45 or whatever to do something in the world. They did it early on. They were right out of college, age 21, 22, and they've gone on to start a development company in Cleveland. That's the 3 of them. This is a house built in Oberlin by friends Carl and Mary McDaniel. This is an entirely solar-powered house. Again, in a city where it's, sunshine is a theory. That's a 5 kW PV array on the roof. This is groundbreaking on a similar house that is done, we hope, is the first of about 50 in the city, that is done also to the same standard, the passive house German standard, but affordable for sale at something $150,000 or less. The owner of the house is the woman. These are her 2 daughters at groundbreaking. This is the owner. These are, excuse me, her 2 daughters. This is a house under construction. It'll open, we think, around April 1st or 2nd. This was a picture taken of the interior several days ago. This is an 11-acre solar array. And we did this 3 summers ago, 3.5 years ago. Had we done the same array last summer, the cost would have come in at 50% less. Solar's technology is basically in free fall. The actual equipment has dropped 80% in the past 5 years. There is no excuse for staying on fossil fuels, not a single excuse for you or for us or for anybody. This is a list of what we've done so far. So the Oberlin project, again, this college-city partnership to build a working model of sustainability. This is what we've done so far. In total, we spent or committed about $106 million. Most of that is private investment money. For every dollar of philanthropy, we've leveraged about $5.75 of investment and other kinds of funding. So that's what we've done so far. Now, the last part of the story is this. If we stop here at a city of 10,000, we'll have done nothing very significant. It becomes a little, quote, model, but it just sits on the shelf as a model. So the question for us now is, can we begin to build a much wider effort at the regional scale? And for us, the regional scale, I left Flint, I inadvertently left Flint off up here, but from Flint, Detroit, Toledo, Oberlin, Cleveland, Youngstown, this is what we're calling the Lake Erie Crescent. That was the heartbeat of the U.S. economy 50 or 60 years ago. That was automobiles, and that was steel, and that was the driver in the U.S. economy. Youngstown, Ohio, in 1941, had the highest per capita income of any city in the country. You go to Youngstown now, it looks like the German army came through in the 1940s and destroyed everything, and nothing's changed since. I remember Youngstown as a kid as a vibrant, prosperous, corrupt, but it was a working city. It was a mill town, and it worked. Detroit, you've heard about. So the question is, can we take what we've learned in Oberlin up to the regional scale? Remember, I started with a single building, and then a little town, and now at the regional scale. So the plan is roughly this. Can we take cities like Detroit? This is downtown Detroit. Everything you see in the foreground as green, those were houses and buildings, and that was part of an economy. Detroit itself is a city, you see in this slide, 140 square miles. It was built and designed to serve both industry and 2.1 million people. Now it's maybe 650,000 people. So notice how sustainability, the challenges of sustainability, looks very different from that perspective as opposed to your perspective, where you got 3 million more people headed your way in the near term. So you got all the problems of growth. We have all the problems of getting out of the growth depression that we've been in. How do we begin to rebuild this as a sustainable, prosperous area? So The idea is very simply this. Number one on this list is to begin to take the buying and investing power of colleges and universities. You spend a lot of money, billions of dollars nationally. Investing, colleges and universities combined have a little over $400 billion of investing power. Harvard has $390 billion of that, and the rest have $10 billion. That's a joke, by the way. How do we focus the buying and investing power on cities, food systems, and solar energy? So we've taken three waves that are already in motion. Green infrastructure in cities, local foods, and renewable energy. How do we begin to shift the buying power of colleges, universities, sports teams, healthcare facilities from one ledger book to another? Begin to use financial strength to move the world differently. It's called import substitution, the third item on the slide. And this comes from a lot of economists' work, and particularly that of Jane Jacobs. So if you make it, grow it, process it, service it locally, or could do so, buy it locally. Keep your money within the local economy. Don't send your dollars to China and whatever. Keep it within the local economy. It's called the multiplier effect. Typically, when you get it right, dollars will stay in the local community for another 2 or 3 cycles. And that simply multiplies the economic advantages. So if you buy from Walmart, we have a Walmart in Oberlin. You buy from Walmart, pennies stay in Oberlin as wages. Most of the money goes directly to Bentonville, Arkansas. And that's why the Walton family is so powerfully wealthy. So, fourth item on this list. I don't think you can solve Detroit or Cleveland or Toledo or Youngstown's problems just within their city boundaries. We've gone too far. But if you take Jane Jacobs' idea of the city region, national economies don't grow, she argued, but city regions do. They drive the national economy. So if you expand the idea of city regions to regions and could city regions begin to drive the local economy in different directions? And could regional economies drive the national economy in different directions? And then you're looking for places where there's a high multiplier. So these are the folks we want to bring together, universities and hospitals and so forth, but this should be led by higher education. This is something we ought to do, not somebody else. And the reasons are very simple. One, number, we got money. We buy and we invest. Number two, we've got the incredible brain power of outstanding faculty and an awful lot of smart people. Number three, we've got the energy and talents of young people, of students, to begin to apply to this. So for us within the Lake Erie Crescent region, the idea is to have 10,000 or 20,000 or 30,000 students at the universities within that region, Michigan, Michigan State, Oberlin, Case Western, and so forth, work with other people to begin to remake that region. And then the fourth thing is simply, the last thing is simply, we ought to do it. We can't be in a position of graduating young people and giving them a degree on the day of graduation and say, oh, by the way, we operate our facilities in ways that are indifferent to your future or destructive to your future. We can't do that. And then imagine the possibilities. This is a picture Elaine and I took from Paul Dolan's box. He's the owner of the Cleveland Indians. And that's why I remain hopeful. I'm never optimistic. I don't want to go into despair, but I remain hopeful year after year as the Indians. We haven't won a major championship since 1964 when Jimmy Brown played for the Browns. And that's before a lot of you were born. We're sitting in Paul Dolan's box. And the point of the slide is this. That dashboard I showed you at the Oberlin Lewis Center, how about taking this, scoreboards from sports teams? I asked Paul if I could have that scoreboard for 20 seconds every 9 innings, just 20 seconds, and then have a class work on that, as we did with the dashboard for the Lewis Center that grew into the company Lucid Design. And what would you want to say to sports fans? But imagine this in the Detroit Lions Stadium and the Cavaliers Stadium, but imagine sports scoreboards as we begin to widen the discussion about sustainability. Sports teams are there. Athletes are coming along. So how do we want to talk to sports fans? Imagine this, you go for the pickup truck driving part of the community, not what Wes Jackson calls the weenie-armed environmentalists. So a strategy of change. Number one, can we take monies already in play? This is no big federal program. This doesn't require federal dollars. Gave a talk on the Hill on this idea several weeks ago. Had Republicans and Democrats come up afterwards and ask what they could do to help. I said, not one thing. Stay out of this. This is not to be politicized. This isn't liberal or conservative. This is simply backwards or forwards. We're talking about how do you take money already in play and move it in a different direction. Get it from one ledger book to another. And there are all kinds of good reasons to do that. Number two, this is surfing waves that already exist. Local foods, you can't get enough demand for local foods. Locally grown organic produce in most of the country exceeds, probably the demand exceeds supply by probably a factor of 2 or 3. You can't grow enough right now, and that market is rapidly growing. And then it's familiar. It's tried, it's true. We've been there before. This is how economies grow. This is nothing new. So the investment strategy, the idea is simply to get the chief financial officers and chief investment officers in a room with some awfully smart people who understand investment, people with backgrounds at Goldman Sachs and JP Morgan, but left before they wrecked the economy, people who thought about investment and what's called impact investing. Can we begin to recalibrate the way money works in the society with where we want to go relative to sustainability? And the answer is yeah, we can. We know that. And if you're in investment, you know now with 10 years of data behind you that sustainability is better as an investment field than non-sustainability. The Bank of England just put out a report last week that said coal stocks are an awfully bad investment, but fossil fuels are generally a bad investment. And so they're saying, they're advising people to pull out of those kind of fossil fuel investments. Now, assuming we get the Lake Erie Crescent going, and that's still aspirational, hasn't happened quite yet, but then could we extend this to other regions, clusters? So we've been in conversation with 9 other clusters around the country, including the Front Range of the Denver Metroplex and so forth. But can we begin to extend this to other regions? How do we make this journey to Montana? All of us have to make it. We've got to get there. And we're not getting there right now. The political structure is log-jammed at the top and log-jammed in a lot of state capitals. Can we in higher education lead the process and move the society in different directions? Not left, not right, not liberal, not conservative, but just progressive toward a much better future. A couple of final comments. I started with some slides about ecological disorder, and you could show the same kind of slides for hours on end and not repeat yourself. Ocean acidification, population growth, species extinction, go on and on and on. We've done a lot of damage to the planet. But that damage, that disorder we see out there started here. It started with our thinking. It is what goes on in our head. The disorder out there reflects a disorder in how we think about the human role in the natural world. It didn't have to be this way. And a lot of places it's not. Number 2, everything you do here in every educational institution, everything that you do is environmental education. We teach people that they're part of or a part from the natural world, and then all the implications that pertain thereunto. So back in the Open Project Amendment, we're saying to our Board of Trustees and to City Council, if you get a driver's license in Ohio, you have to read a little book like that, and you have to take a test, and you have to drive around as a patient for, a student driver for, Lord knows how long, 6 weeks or whatever. But if you are elected to the Board of Trustees and you're driving a college, or the city council and you're driving a city, you don't have to take any such training. So we're saying that everybody goes to city council or board of trustees ought to have, let's say, at least 4 hours of training. 2 hours on here's how the world works as a physical system, just the science. And then 2 hours on why that information is important for how you run a city or a college. Imagine that. You can't run a university or a college until you know the planet that that institution is located on. The problem of unsustainability. This is Karl Heinrich Geber. Systemic errors of societal design will make things worse and worse. Until the systemic errors are addressed, the very conditions for survival and prosperity will continue to systematically decline. The problem is that the industrial society is designed so that pollutants are bound to increase in concentrations globally, and that includes carbon dioxide. This is in every way a systems problem. Our old habits of mind of breaking things into components and into silos and so forth, that doesn't work, not for this world any longer. One political note. Oxfam released a report about a month ago that showed that 80 people, you could easily have them in half of this room, control more net wealth than the bottom half of humankind altogether. So this journey from Lonesome Dove to Montana, we got an awful lot of people walking. And we got a couple of folks that want to go by stretch limo. You're not going to make the journey that way. We're going to have to reckon with some hard political realities. You can't distribute wealth that unfairly. If you take 400 people in this country alone, 400 people have more net wealth than the bottom 185 million Americans. And we can't talk about distribution. We've got to. Two last thoughts. One of the great little books, we struggle with what's sustainability all about. And we really don't know. But it doesn't have to be very complicated. Robert Fulghum, who wrote a book, All I Ever Needed to Know I Learned in Kindergarten, has in the book the rules that we all learned them in kindergarten. Number one, play fair. Play by the rules. And that applies to the financiers, that applies to everybody. Number two, clean up your messes. If you make a mess, and we all do, clean it up. Number three, share your cookies. That world where 80 people have more net wealth than the bottom 3.7 billion people. Share your cookies. Number four, don't take things that aren't yours, including things that by right belong to future generations. The world that we inherited that we've got to pass on, we're obliged to pass on to them. And number four, when in danger, hold hands when you're crossing the street. We're in dangerous times. And then the last thing I want to say is this. And this is from Martin Luther King. This is a paper called The Fierce Urgency of Now speech. It's one of the great state papers in U.S. history. And next year he was killed. He says this: we're now faced with the fact that tomorrow is today. We're confronted with the fierce urgency of now. In this unfolding conundrum of life and history, there is such a thing as being too late. Procrastination is still the thief of time. Life often leaves us standing bare, naked and dejected with a lost opportunity. The tide in the affairs of men doesn't remain at the flood. It ebbs. And we may cry out desperately for time to pause in her passage, but time is deaf to every plea and rushes on. Over the bleached bones and jumbled residue of numerous civilizations are written the pathetic words, too late. We can't be too late. We're going to Montana. We're going to make the journey. We may stop in Utah for a while, but we are going to Montana. We're going to make that journey, but we have to make it with a sense of real urgency, and that means you and me and increasingly people all around the earth. Thank you very much.
Questions? You have time. We have time for a few questions for David.
Hi, thank you. You began the talk with distinguishing how we react to fear, the tiger with the teeth and claws versus science and words. What moves people that sort of are taking action versus those that aren't, and how can we turn those words and science into action and immediate action?
Well, that's a good question. You're an architect. The world we live in now has this strange convergence of what we ought to do, given everything that we know about the human situation, and what's the smart thing to do. And so when we talk to university investors and so forth, the smartest investments they can make are probably going to be local, where they can manage a good bit of the money and they can see the results of it. It's going to be sustainable, and the investment world and business world is changing dramatically in that way. And so a lot of the argument, it depends on which side you're on. There are still people who deny climate change. Fine, let them deny it. There's still a Flat Earth Society office, I'm told, in London. So fine, it's all right, you can believe what you want to, but you can't choose your facts. You can choose your beliefs, you can't choose your facts. They're simply part of science and the empirical world. But the facts are increasingly that this sustainability is a convergence of necessity and rightness. And it's opportunity to avoid lots of problems, it's opportunity to make money if that's important to you. So I don't personally like to much get involved in arguments about is climate change real or not. People will find out that it's real. The science has been over for decades. I mean, quite literally, all we add, as somebody said last night at dinner, was a few more pixels. The picture gets more and more clearly defined. But the science has been known for a long time. Put heat-trapping gases in the atmosphere from the combustion of fossil fuels, you trap heat. Put a whole lot of them there, you will trap a whole lot of heat. There's nothing very complicated about it at that level. But we know that the science has been increasingly rigorous. I don't really care to debate that. That's not. So if James Imhoff walks into the Senate, as he did, holding a snowball, which purportedly proved that climate change wasn't real, cool, fine. The man with a snowball can do what he wants to do, but the science is. And you know, you compare this, I'm on a soapbox opera here, or soapbox just for a second, but the science is such that 97% of scientists, we are told, believe basically the theory of climate change as it's been given in Science magazine, Nature, and in scientific literature. When you feel chest pains coming on, you don't go to the 3% equivalent of naysayers on the medical front. You want somebody with degrees from Harvard Medical School or University of Utah or whatever, but you want somebody who's got degrees and credentials, not somebody who listens to Rush Limbaugh nonstop. And so, nothing against Rush Limbaugh. Well, yeah, a lot against Rush Limbaugh. But that's the strange world we're in right now. And the biggest issue we face has been that we as a nation are scientifically illiterate and becoming more so. And so we got, you know, the polls come out that, you know, 50% of the public doesn't believe in evolution or whatever the numbers are. 65% or some such believe in alien abduction. I actually believe in alien abduction, man. It's the only way I can explain some of my students. But you know, we've got to become scientists. The issues are too big. But this, again, is this convergence of what we should do as morality and what we ought to do for just simply reasons of smartness. But thanks for the question.
Question back.
So it seems apparent to me that in the Oberlin project, as an example, that this takes an intense amount of cooperation with several entities. How do you work with political entities to move some of these projects forward? Because one of the considerations isn't always financial. And it can be political, and it can be, some of these other elements can really have an effect. So how do you negotiate some of those relationships?
Mayor Caldwell was here. I was going to defer to him. Well, we don't have political conflicts in Oberlin. It's sweetness and light all the time. You know, I think you find ways, we've got to find ways to bring everybody along. And so everybody's got to be part of this. And in our case, we're a city with a 28% poverty level. It may be as low as 24%, but it's considerable. And so you've got that contingent to bring along. You've got to make sustainability work for the least of us. You've got people who are academics, and they're not always good in the political arena. You've got to simply work through, there's no magic formula to work through any kind of political discussion. And we've had our battles about things, but there are all kinds of ways to begin to move things. One of the things that's helped us has been when we were recognized as one of the Clinton climate partners. That helped because the public recognition then was a big deal. The White House named Oberlin as one of 16 climate champion cities last November, and that helps. People like the limelight and like the publicity. But at the end of the day, what we have to do is to move sustainability into the economic realm. We've got to show that there are jobs and employment, that it creates employment. It doesn't come as a cost, it comes as a benefit. And so the best thing for us is when we have a substantial number of people that show up for city council hearings because their paycheck depends on it. They're part of an economy that is based in the new foods economy or the solar economy or rebuilding houses or all the derivative businesses that spin out of that. But sustainability has got to become an employer of people, and that'll make it. But thanks for the question. And there's no magic answer to that. But thanks for raising the issue.
Yeah, I'm curious if you are personally part of the Oberlin's part of the Georgetown University Energy Prize, and how that's going. And lastly, how are you ever going to beat Park City, Utah in this challenge?
Did I sense a loaded question there? Yeah, we are part of it. It's something that we, the Open Project, sponsored, and we are one of the semifinalists. We're just going to whoop you. That's all there is to it. You know, I was out in Claremont a couple of weeks ago, and they're also part of the challenge. And there's some the beauty of this thing is this: the competition is great, isn't it? I mean, you see some really smart people, some really dedicated public officials and people in the private sector doing amazing things. This is America at its best. And whether you win, lose, or draw, I don't know. I mean, I count all of us as winners in this effort. But thanks for raising that issue. I think this is what we do as Americans, I think, really, really well. And coming out of this, everybody will win. Every one of those communities, and some that were not part of the semifinal round, every one of those communities is going to do incredibly better. We've now focused on energy and energy efficiency and how we use it, and we're thinking about it. But anyway, thanks for that question. We'll talk later.
We have one over here.
Thank you. Thanks for your great work with the Bioneers. I spend a lot of time with the Bioneers, so they're a great group. Take a guess as to what you think is going to happen in Paris later this year with the Sustainability Summit.
Oh, I don't have any insight into that. This is Conference of the Parties meeting in Paris. I've got no particular insight. So far, the COP meetings have been a real disappointment. I mean, very little has come out relative to what should have come out a long time ago. So I don't know. I think there's more pressure now, and with the Chinese-U.S. agreement forged a couple of months ago, I mean, it lends real pressure. And China has actually moved pretty dramatically. Chinese coal use may peak as soon as 2020 by some reports. And the Chinese have stopped. The Chinese were building coal-fired power plants 1 or 2 a week, depending on who you read. That has slowed almost to a stop now. And so I think there's reason for some controlled optimism that something good is going to come out of this. In the meantime, I think if we'd been here 20 years ago, and knowing what we now know, but it was 20 years ago, we couldn't have foreseen how big a movement this is. But you can't go anywhere in the world without finding people doing sustainability work. There is a grassroots revolution taking place, and it's really worldwide. It doesn't say we don't have problems, but it is worldwide, and it flourishes in places where you wouldn't expect it to flourish. But it's places that are poor and forgotten and disinvested and in out-of-the-way places. But there is a world revolution. So whatever happens at COP 15 or wherever we are, the pressure from the bottom is beginning to build. And the whole point of the Lake Erie Crescent and similar clusters is to begin to aggregate that and take it to scale in a meaningful way. This, again, not left or right, not liberal or Democrat, Republican. It's outside for the time being. It's beyond politics. It's saying, how can we use money to move the system towards sustainability? So how do we get to Montana? The fuel in that engine to get us to Montana, that vision of sustainability, I think is beginning to emerge as, at least in large measure, not totally, but in large measure, a financial strategy to shift money from doing harm in the world to doing good in the world. And that also, by the way, is the smartest kind of investment. Again, the Bank of England report last week was one of probably 30 such reports from financial agencies. And so in the meantime, whatever happens at the top with decision makers among various nation states, at the bottom there is a lot of movement now. And that is cause for hope. Not yet optimism, but for hope. But thanks for that.
Other questions? Okay. David, thank you very much. We really appreciate you coming.